The year was 2287, and Earth had become nothing more than a whisper in the cosmos, a distant legend among the scattered human colonies. The Cinder Empire had ruled the galaxy for centuries, their vast fleets dominating every star system they controlled. Humanity, once a powerful force in the galaxy, had been brought low after an ancient pact with the Cinder. In exchange for sparing Earth from annihilation, humans had sworn an oath, never to defy the Cinder, never to raise arms against their unchallenged rule. It was a pact born of desperation, made in the wake of a cataclysmic war that nearly wiped out the human race. But time, as it always does, has a way of eroding even the strongest oaths. Captain Evelyn Solis stood in the command center of the Pride of Earth, a colossal warship once meant to lead humanity's defense in the war against the Cinder. Now it was all that remained of Earth's military might, an antique relic, its weapons rusting, its systems out of date. Yet, as Solis stared out into the void, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ship held more than just history. It held a future that was slipping through her fingers. The message had come through a secure channel, encrypted with a pattern dating back to Earth's first contact with the Cinder. The words were a warning, though cryptic in their nature. The prophecy spoke of a time when humanity would break its silence and rise against the Cinder, a time when the shattered remnants of Earth would defy its oldest promise. But why now? Why after centuries of submission? Solis's hand gripped the edge of the command console as she replayed the message one more time. The voice was faint but unmistakable. The oath was never meant to last forever. The future of humanity depends on your defiance. Her mind raced, torn between the weight of the ancient promise and the need to protect what was left of humanity. The Cinder were not merciful. They never had been. To break the pact would mean total annihilation. But what kind of life could humanity continue to live under their oppressive thumb? Earth had once been a cradle of civilization, a beacon of hope for the stars, but now it was nothing more than a faded memory. "Captain, we've detected a Cinder scout ship," reported Lieutenant Kessler, his voice taut with urgency. "It's on an intercept course for the human colonies in the Delphian system." Solis's heart skipped a beat. The Delphian system was home to one of the last human settlements, a thriving colony that had managed to escape the Cinder's influence for decades. If the Cinder were coming, this would not be a simple scouting mission. It would be an invasion. "We can't allow them to attack," Solis muttered to herself, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Not again. She turned to Kessler, her face set with determination. "Prepare the Pride of Earth. We're going to stop them." "But, Captain," Kessler began, his voice cautious, "breaking the oath means war. The Cinder will retaliate. The entire galaxy will be on us." "I know," Solis said, cutting him off. "But if we don't act now, humanity will have nothing left to protect. We fight for the future. We fight for Earth." She gave the command, our decision made. As the crew scrambled to prepare for the assault, Solis stood in silence, staring out into the stars. The oath, forged in desperation so many centuries ago, had bound humanity to a fate of submission. But now humanity had a choice. And for the first time in a long while, Captain Evelyn Solis felt something stir within her, a spark of hope that had long been extinguished. The Pride of Earth would carry that spark into battle, and with it, the possibility of a future where humanity was free. But Solis knew one thing for certain. Once they crossed that line, there would be no turning back. The war for humanity's future had just begun. The journey to Earth was no longer just about reclaiming humanity's past. It was a desperate race against time. The Cinder Empire, now aware of the broken pact, would be relentless. Captain Solis could already feel the looming threat, heavy in the air. Her mind was focused entirely on one objective: to get to Earth first, to awaken whatever weapon the Whisper had mentioned before the Sindar could seize it. "Captain, we're nearing the edge of the Delphian system." Kessler's voice interrupted her thoughts. His tone was crisp, but it carried the tension of the moment. "The Sindar response fleet will arrive within a few hours." Solus nodded grimly. The stakes had just escalated. "Prepare for warp jump. We have no time to waste." The crew moved swiftly, their routines owned by years of service on the Pride of Earth. Yet there was a sense of urgency today that none of them had ever felt before. Humanity's survival was no longer guaranteed. This wasn't just another mission. It was the beginning of a war that would define the fate of an entire species. As the ship powered up its engines for the jump, Solus allowed herself a fleeting moment to reflect. The Sindar had been merciless in their conquest of human colonies, wiping out any resistance with ease. The pact that Earth had made all those years ago had seemed like the only option at the time, an oath that would protect humanity from total annihilation. But it had been a lie, a cage. Now Earth would defy it, but the price was steep. Our thoughts were interrupted as the ship shuddered from the warp jump. The stars around them blurred into streaks of light before snapping back into focus. They had arrived in Earth's orbit. "Captain, we're in position," Lieutenant Kessler said, voice tight. "We've made it." But the sense of accomplishment was fleeting. The comms flickered to life with an urgent transmission from the Whisper. "Captain," the voice crackled. "The Sindar are moving faster than we expected. They've sent a battler group to Earth's vicinity. You need to reach the site of the weapon before they do. The entrance is hidden beneath the ruins of Old New York, near the sector known as the Blackened Zone. It's an underground complex. Once inside, you'll find the weapon. But be warned, there are traps. The builders of that weapon didn't trust anyone." A chill ran down Solus's spine. Traps. The Sindar would be relentless, and Earth was now as dangerous to humanity as it was to their enemies. The abandoned cities, once a symbol of human pride, were now ruins that could either offer salvation or lead them straight into a grave. "Understood," Solus replied firmly, though her stomach twisted at the thought. "Set course for the Blackened Zone. Prepare for heavy resistance." Kessler looked up, his brow furrowed. "You're not serious, are you? The Sindar will be all over that area by now." "They'll be expecting us to land," Solus said, her voice unwavering. "We're not going to play their game. Prepare a strike team. We'll make a stealth approach through the atmosphere and land behind their lines." "Captain," Kessler pressed, "we're talking about direct infiltration into enemy territory. This won't just be a fight. It'll be a bloodbath." Solus locked eyes with her first officer. "We fight or we die. There is no in-between. The Sindar may have the numbers, but we have something they'll never understand: the heart of humanity." The room fell silent. The weight of the decision hung over them like a shadow. But it was a decision they all knew was necessary. The war for Earth's future had already begun, and there would be no retreat. They would either reclaim what was theirs or burn with the wreckage of their homeworld. As the crew prepared for the dangerous mission ahead, Solus stood by the command center, gazing out at the planet below. Earth, the cradle of humanity, was now a battleground, and it was up to them to determine which side would prevail. "Let's move out," Solus ordered. "It's time to take Earth back." The Pride of Earth descended through the atmosphere, its stealth systems engaged as it sliced through the skies, a dark coast in the night. Below, the ruins of Old New York loomed, an eerie reminder of a time long gone. As the ship closed in on its destination, Solas's heart beat louder with every passing second. The Cinder were coming, and this time Earth would fight back. The Pride of Earth cut through the upper atmosphere with the precision of a blade through flesh, its cloaking systems rendering it nearly invisible to the Cinder fleet in orbit above. As they neared the ruins of Old New York, Captain Solas gripped the armrest of her command chair, her mind focused entirely on the mission. The Cinder battler group had yet to realize that the Pride had slipped past their defenses, and she intended to keep it that way. For now. Stealth mode engaged, Captain, Kessler reported, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. We're almost over the blackened zone. Landing sequence is ready. Solas nodded, her fingers tapping against the console. She could feel the pull of the city below, the weight of history bearing down on her. The blackened zone, once the heart of New York City, was now a wasteland, skyscrapers reduced to skeletal remains, streets cracked and forgotten, the aftermath of centuries of decay and destruction. But beneath those ruins lay something humanity could never forget, the weapon that could change everything. We're approaching the coordinates, Kessler said, breaking into her thoughts. Cinder signals are stronger. They've detected us. A flash of alarm flickered in Solas's chest. They had been too slow. The Cinder were no longer passive. They had detected the anomaly, and they would be ready. Prepare the strike team. We land on my mark, she ordered, her voice tight. No matter what happens, we get to that underground complex. Understood, Kessler replied, and the crew scrambled to make final preparations. Suddenly, the ship jolted, the hull rattling with a deafening vibration. The comm system blared with a shrill warning. Energy surge detected. Cinder ship engaging. Solas's eyes snapped to the tactical display. A Cinder warship had broken from the shadows, its sleek form cutting through the blackness of space like a predator. It was too close, and their cloaking systems couldn't conceal them now. Captain, they've locked onto us. Kessler shouted, panic creeping into his voice. We're under attack. Damn it. Solas swore under her breath, the realization crashing down on her. The Cinder had found them, and it was only a matter of time before they fired. The ship's stealth had bought them some time, but now they would have to fight. Deploy countermeasures. Solas barked. Full evasive maneuvers. Get us below their weapons range. The Pride lurched as the crew scrambled to respond. Kessler executed evasive maneuvers with expert precision, but the Cinder ship's weapons fired almost immediately, sending bolts of searing energy toward them. The Pride shook violently as it connected, sending sparks flying and triggering alarms throughout the command center. Shields at 60%. Shouted Lieutenant Vargas, the ship's chief engineer. We won't last long if we don't do something. We don't need to last long, Solas said, her voice low but resolute. We need to survive long enough to reach the surface. Hold them off for just a few more minutes. Kessler's hands danced over the controls, executing sharp turns that sent the Pride tumbling through the sky, narrowly avoiding the Cinder's destructive energy blasts. But even as they maneuvered, the Pride's hull groaned under the strain. Every moment they spent evading the Cinder was a moment lost in their race to the surface. Captain, Vargas shouted, his face pale. The hull integrity is failing. If we don't land soon, we'll lose the ship. The words hit Solas like a punch to the gut. She couldn't afford to lose the Pride. It was all they had left, humanity's last hope. But they were being cornered, and there was no time for hesitation. Engage the landing sequence, she ordered, her voice cold and decisive. "We'll make it on the ground or die trying." Without hesitation, Kessler initiated the descent, pushing the Pride into a steep dive toward the heart of the blackened zone. The ship groaned in protest, the hull groaning as it fought to stay intact against the atmospheric drag and the fire from the Sindar ship. Below, the ruined city sprawled out beneath them, the skeletal remains of New York, like a graveyard of civilization. But even as the Pride descended, the Sindar ship closed in. Its weapons fired again, this time striking the Pride's starboard side with an explosion that sent a violent shockwave through the entire vessel. Sparks and smoke erupted in the command center as Solace braced herself against the blast. "Captain," Kessler screamed, his voice strained. "We're losing control." The ship tilted, its trajectory spiraling as the hull buckled from the repeated hits. Solace's heart raced. This was it. They had only seconds left. "Deploy the emergency thrusters." Solace shouted. "Get us down now." With a final surge of effort, the ship's thrusters ignited, and the Pride of Earth slammed into the ruined streets of old New York. The force of the impact sent the ship skidding along the cracked pavement, its hull scraping and grinding against the earth. The ship finally came to a violent halt, a cloud of dust and debris filling the air. Silence followed, broken only by the distant thrum of the Sindar ship still hovering overhead. The Pride of Earth had survived. Barely. Everyone alive. Solace's voice was strained, but she forced herself to focus. The crew began to check in, their voices a mix of relief and exhaustion. But the fight was far from over. Solace stood up, her gaze fixed on the ruined skyline beyond the hull. The Sindar would be on the ground soon, and they would be waiting for her. It was time to make her move. "Prepare for the ground assault," Solace said, her tone fierce. "We'll take the fight to them." The Pride of Earth lay battered in the heart of old New York, smoke billowing from its ruptured hull, yet it had served its purpose. They were on the ground, just a few miles away from the blackened zone's underground entrance. The Sindar ship, though still hovering above, had momentarily pulled back, likely to regroup and launch another assault. But Solace knew that wouldn't last long. Time was already running out. "Captain, the Sindar are repositioning," Kessler reported as he studied the external surveillance monitors. "They'll be here in less than 10 minutes." Solace's heart raced. The Sindar would be relentless. They'd already discovered Earth was no longer bound by the old pact. They would wipe out any trace of human resistance with a speed and precision that would leave no room for error. The clock was ticking, and they had no more time to waste. "Strike team, prepare for immediate deployment," Solace ordered, standing up from her chair with renewed determination. "We're heading into the blackened zone, and we're not leaving until we find that weapon." The strike team, a specially trained group of soldiers, moved swiftly to the cargo bay, their movements synchronized as they donned their battle gear. They were the best humanity had left, tough, hardened by years of conflict, and loyal to the very last breath. They were humanity's final line of defense. "Lieutenant Vargas," Solace called, "I need a damage report." Vargas, standing near the tactical console, quickly scanned the ship's systems. "Hull breaches are extensive. We've lost several of our weapons arrays and the secondary engines. But the primary engines are intact, as are the communications arrays. We can still transmit signals." "Good," Solace replied. She had no intention of retreating, but it was a relief to know they still had the means to send a message if things went south. She turned her attention to the strike team, who were now fully geared up and ready. "Let's move. We'll take the back alleys to avoid detection." We need to get to the entrance before the Sindar make their move. The team filed out of the cargo bay, Solace at the front. They moved swiftly through the streets, the remains of the once great city towering over them, its cracked pavement and skeletal skyscrapers a silent witness to humanity's fall. It was an eerie scene, the silence broken only by the faint hum of distant explosions and the occasional crackle of radio chatter. "Stay sharp," Solace ordered, her voice low but commanding. "The Sindar won't be far behind." They made their way through the ruins, the destruction around them almost surreal. What had once been a bustling city, home to millions of people, was now little more than a charred wasteland, littered with debris and the remnants of war. But Solace couldn't afford to dwell on the past. The weapon they sought was buried somewhere beneath this city, and with it lay humanity's last hope. As they neared the entrance to the blackened zone, Solace's heart pounded in her chest. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like a countdown to the inevitable confrontation with the Sindar. The underground complex loomed ahead, a dark, foreboding structure that seemed to have been waiting for them, its sealed doors almost mocking them with their impenetrable silence. "We're here," Solace said, nodding to Kessler, who quickly analyzed the entrance. It was fortified, with advanced Sindar tech embedded in the walls. The Sindar had clearly suspected something was hidden here, and they had taken precautions. Vargas stepped forward, his expression grim. "We're going to need heavy ordnance to breach this." Solace nodded. "Do what you have to do. We don't have time to waste." Vargas and his team began setting up explosives, their movements swift and precise. Solace stood back, watching the crew work with quiet admiration. These were the people who had kept humanity's flickering flame alive in the darkness, and she knew that without them, Earth would already be lost. With a final controlled blast, the doors to the blackened zone crumpled, revealing a long dark hallway that stretched deep into the earth. "Let's move," Solace ordered, her voice echoing through the narrow corridor. "Stick together and watch your backs." The team moved in, their weapons raised, eyes scanning every corner for danger. The dim glow of emergency lights flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The air was stale and thick with the scent of ancient dust. The deeper they went, the colder it became, like the weight of the world pressing in on them. As they reached the heart of the complex, a massive chamber opened before them, the walls lined with strange, ancient technology. But there was no time to admire the craftsmanship of the old world. Solace's eyes locked onto a central platform, where a towering device stood in the middle of the room, its surface etched with symbols Solace had never seen before. "This is it," Kessler whispered, awe in his voice. But before Solace could respond, the silence of the room was shattered by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and echoing from the hallway they had just passed. The Sindar had arrived. "Get ready," Solace shouted, her voice a sharp command. "We're not leaving empty-handed." The battle for Earth's future was about to begin. The darkened subway tunnel stretched before them, an eerie silence enveloping the group as they descended into the depths of Earth's forgotten heart. The walls, once lined with graffiti and advertisements, were now marked with the scars of time and battle, shattered tiles, cracked beams, and the decayed remnants of human civilization. The stench of old oil and rust permeated the air, mixing with the faint metallic scent of blood from previous skirmishes. Solace led the way, her boots making soft echoes as they stepped onto the cold concrete floor. The strike team moved in perfect formation, their senses heightened, eyes flicking back and forth as they surveyed the shadows. They were deep inside the ruins of old New York, far beyond the Sindar's radar, but Solace couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "They're here," Vargas muttered under his breath, his fingers tightening around the grip of his weapon. He had a look in his eyes, one that spoke of battle-hardened instinct. "Stay alert," Solace replied quietly. "This place is a tomb, and we're its trespassers." The elevator shaft they had found led them to a hidden sub-level, deeper than any human had ventured in centuries. As they progressed into the heart of the underground complex, the walls became smoother, the air colder. It was as though they were entering a place untouched by time. The glow of their flashlights revealed the occasional metal door, some old, some newer, all with cryptic symbols etched into their surfaces. "It's here," Kessler said, his voice reverberating against the metal walls. He stopped in front of a door at the far end of the tunnel. "This is the entrance." Solace studied the door. Unlike the others, this one was reinforced, its surface pristine and untouched by the passage of time. She could feel the hum of something beyond it, a power that seemed to pulse from the very walls of the chamber. She nodded at Kessler. "Open it." Kessler approached the door, pulling out a device that looked more like an ancient relic than a piece of modern tech. He inserted it into a slot on the door, and for a moment nothing happened. The silence was suffocating, as though the entire complex was holding its breath. Then, with a loud mechanical hiss, the door groaned open. The strike team moved into position, weapons at the ready. Solace signaled for them to advance, and they stepped into the unknown. The room beyond was vast, its dimensions impossible to comprehend in the low light. The ceiling stretched high above them, obscured by darkness, while the floor seemed to extend into infinity. In the center of the room stood a massive structure, an ancient machine that looked as though it had been designed for something far beyond human understanding. Its surface was covered in strange alien runes that glowed faintly in the dim light, casting an ethereal green hue on everything around it. Solace felt a chill run down her spine. There was no mistaking it. The weapon was here. She approached the center of the room, her boots echoing in the vast emptiness. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The whispers of the past seemed to call to her, telling her the story of those who had built this place, who had designed the weapon, and why they had hidden it so deeply. They had known something the Cinder didn't, something the Empire would never be able to understand. "This is it," Solace said, her voice a low whisper. "The weapon that will turn the tide, but we need to figure out how it works." "We're not alone," Vargas growled, his voice sharp with warning. His weapon was aimed at the far end of the room, where shadows stirred. Solace's instincts flared. She turned sharply, scanning the room for movement. A flicker of light, too faint to be natural, darted across the far wall. She motioned for the team to spread out. Then they heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, soft, yet deliberate, echoed through the cavernous room. Another flicker of light, and there they were, shadows in the dark, their outlines barely visible. Cinder. The strike team moved quickly, taking cover behind the massive columns that supported the ceiling. Solace's heart raced as she assessed the situation. The Cinder had tracked them here. No surprise there. But now they were in their territory, and there would be no easy escape. "They know we're here," Kessler said grimly, his eyes locked on the approaching figures. "We've got company." Solace drew her sidearm, feeling the weight of the moment. "We need to buy time. Get the weapon online. Vargas, Kessler, hold them off." Without another word, the team split into two groups. Solace and Kessler moved toward the ancient machine, while Vargas and the other soldiers took defensive positions, weapons ready. The Cinder closed in, their footsteps becoming louder, their forms more defined. The first shots rang out, and the room exploded into chaos. A deafening barrage of energy blasts filled the air, lighting up the cavernous space with blinding flashes of blue and green. Solace ducked behind the massive machine, her heart pounding, but she couldn't afford to lose focus. She needed to figure out how to activate it. Kessler's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Captain, we've got seconds. If we don't do something now, we're done." Solace nodded grimly, her eyes scanning the alien symbols on the machine. They weren't just decorations, they were instructions, codes, the key to unlocking the power buried within. Her fingers flew over the symbols, tracing them, pushing buttons, adjusting levers. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the very air vibrating as if it knew what was coming. A low hum began to emanate from the machine, and for the first time, Solace allowed herself a brief moment of hope. The weapon was coming online, but as the energy gathered, the Sindar closed in, their presence a looming threat that could crush everything they had worked for. "Time's up," Solace muttered under her breath. The hum from the ancient machine grew louder, vibrating through the cold air like the beating of a heart. Solace could feel the power gathering, the raw energy building beneath her fingertips. It was alive with a purpose. She only hoped they could unlock its full potential before the Sindar crushed them all. "Almost there," she muttered, her fingers tracing the final symbols on the panel. But the sound of approaching footsteps reminded her that time was quickly running out. Vargas's voice crackled in her earpiece, urgent and strained. "Captain, they're closing in on us fast. We're holding them off, but I don't know how much longer we can keep them at bay." The distinct sound of energy blasts echoed from behind her, the crackling noise of weapons fire punctuating the air like thunder. She could hear the battle raging on as her team fought for their lives. But Solace couldn't afford to be distracted. She had one chance, and it was slipping through her fingers with every passing second. She pressed harder, willing the machine to activate, when suddenly a jolt of energy surged from the console. The chamber shuddered with a deep resonance, and a low, guttural sound filled the space. Solace gritted her teeth and held her position, her hand now wrapped around a central lever. The symbols had been activated. The weapon was responding. "Kessler, get ready," Solace shouted, even as a loud explosion rang out from the back of the room. One of their defensive positions had fallen, the sound of it echoing through the underground chamber. The Sindar had breached their perimeter. But before she could react, a blinding beam of energy shot upward from the center of the machine. It burst into the ceiling with a tremendous crash, sending chunks of rock and debris flying into the air. The entire room trembled, as if the very foundations of the city had been shaken awake after centuries of slumber. "Holy hell!" Kessler gasped, staring in awe at the massive energy beam that now seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. It pulsed, filling the room with an overwhelming force. Solace barely had time to register the significance of the beam when a fresh barrage of energy blasts struck the room from the Sindar's weapons. The air filled with sparks and debris as the strike team scrambled to find cover. The Sindar had made it to the heart of the chamber. They were everywhere now, dark figures clad in armor, their eyes glowing with malice as they closed in on their prey. Solace could see their leader now, the commander, a tall figure in gleaming black armor, exuding an aura of ruthless power. He was making his way toward the machine. "Get away from it," Solace shouted, raising her sidearm and taking a shot at the advancing figure. Her blast hit the Sindar commander's shield, ricocheting off with a deafening crack. Kessler turned to her, his expression grim. "We don't have much time, Captain. We have to make this count. The Sindar commander's men moved with a terrifying efficiency, cutting through the remaining resistance of Solis's team. Vargas held them back for as long as he could, but even he was beginning to look overwhelmed. His rifle blazed in the air, striking down Sindar soldiers, but for every one he dropped, 2 more appeared to take their place. Solis's heart raced. The weapon, the one thing that could change everything, was now a beacon, drawing both hope and destruction to itself. The Sindar knew it, and they would stop at nothing to seize control. As the Sindar forces advanced, Solis saw her opportunity. She turned to Kessler, who was keeping an eye on the rapidly escalating situation. "We have one shot," she said urgently. "If we activate the full power, it'll wipe them out. It's not just a weapon, it's a scorched earth device." Kessler's eyes widened. "You're talking about a full activation. That could destroy everything. Do you want to give up humanity's last chance?" Solis shot back, her voice biting. She had no other option. The Sindar could not take this weapon, not after everything they had fought for. Kessler hesitated only a moment, then nodded. "Do it." Solis took a deep breath, her hand trembling for a moment before she gripped the final lever on the machine. She turned it with a sharp twist, and the weapon roared to life. The energy in the room shifted violently, growing stronger, hotter. A powerful force began to surge outward, crackling through the room like an electric storm. The Sindar commander screamed in frustration, his soldiers desperately trying to regroup, but it was already too late. The machine's power was overwhelming, its beam now filling the entire chamber, engulfing everything in its path. Solis had activated the core. The Sindar commander's eyes locked onto her, fury written across his face as the light intensified. But it was useless. The weapon was no longer in her control. It was in the control of the Earth itself, and the ancient creators had designed it to ensure that no force could stand against its might. A blinding flash of white light filled the chamber. Solis's heart pounded in her chest as the world around her exploded into pure, searing brilliance. The energy pulse washed over everything, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then the ground shook beneath their feet as the weapon's shockwave tore through the entire underground complex. The Sindar were obliterated in an instant, their forces reduced to dust before they could even react. But the destruction didn't stop there. The entire city began to tremble as if the earth was waking from a deep slumber. The force of the blast was spreading, and Solis knew that nothing could stop it now. The weapon was in motion, and it would not be contained. "We need to get out, now." Solis shouted to her team, her voice urgent, as the walls began to crack around them. With the ground shaking violently beneath their feet, they had no choice but to flee. The weapon had been activated. The endgame had begun. The air was thick with dust, and the acrid stench of burning metal, as the team scrambled to retreat. The tremors of the weapon's full activation had turned the underground complex into a collapsing ruin. Solis could feel the weight of the earth itself groaning, as if every inch of the city was being torn apart by the weapon's power. "Move! Move!" she shouted, her voice hoarse with urgency. The walls were beginning to crack and crumble around them, the ceiling groaning with each tremor that reverberated through the ground. The machine had unleashed a force beyond comprehension, and there was no telling how long the complex would hold together. Kessler led the way, his rifle slung across his back as he dashed toward the tunnel entrance. "We're not far from the surface," he called back, his voice strained but steady. "If we can make it to the upper levels, we can get back to the Pride." Solis didn't need to be told twice. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't help looking over her shoulder, watching the destruction unfold. The weapon had unleashed a cataclysmic wave of energy, and it was clear that the entire underground system would be swallowed by the chaos. Every step was a race against time, the floor beneath them shaking as more of the tunnels buckled and cracked. The team ran through the narrow, crumbling passages, the distant sounds of falling debris echoing through the air. Vargas was close behind, his eyes darting nervously as he glanced over his shoulder. "How much longer until we reach the surface?" he shouted. "Just a few more corridors." Kessler called back, his pace never faltering, but Solis could see the strain in his face. Every second they spent underground brought them closer to the inevitable collapse. Another explosion rocked the chamber, sending a wave of heat and dust flying in all directions. Solis stumbled, but caught herself against the wall. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the noise of the destruction outside the tunnel was deafening. She could feel the very ground shudder beneath her feet. "We're not going to make it," Vargas said, his voice edged with panic. "It's going to collapse before we get out." "We have no choice," Solis snapped. "We run. We don't stop. We'll get there. Do you hear me? We will get out." With a grim nod, Vargas fell back into step, but Solis could see the doubt in his eyes. The tunnels ahead were becoming narrower, and the light from their flashlights flickered as the power grids above them began to fail. The weight of the earth was pressing in on them, as if trying to bury them alive. "We need to get up there now." Kessler called again, his voice rising over the noise of the crumbling tunnels. "The Pride's not far. We can make it." The team pressed on, their movements frantic as the tunnel grew darker with each passing second. Solis pushed herself harder, her legs burning as they raced toward the surface, the weight of what they had just unleashed on the world hanging heavily in her mind. The weapon had done its job. It had wiped out the Sindar forces. But in doing so, it had released a force that might tear everything apart, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, the ground beneath them jolted violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. The tunnel they were in buckled under the strain, and a massive chunk of rock from the ceiling crashed to the ground, blocking their path. Dust and debris flew through the air, and Solis barely managed to avoid being hit by the falling rubble. "Captain," Kessler shouted, his eyes wide with panic. "We're trapped." Solis's heart raced. There was no time to waste. She couldn't allow her team to be buried alive. She scanned the area, her mind racing for a solution. "There!" She pointed to a narrow passage on the left. "We can go through there." Kessler didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The team turned and sprinted toward the new passage, squeezing through the narrow opening just as the tunnel behind them gave way completely. The ground trembled again as another explosion rocked the cavern, sending another wave of dust and debris flying. But they didn't stop. Solis didn't allow herself to think about the danger. They had to move. As they pushed forward, they reached a set of rusty metal stairs, leading up into the darkness. Solis's hand brushed the railing, feeling its age and the tremors of the earth's movement. She climbed quickly, ignoring the pain in her legs as she raced upward. The sound of destruction grew louder with every step, and Solis couldn't shake the feeling that the entire city was on the brink of collapse. The weapon they had activated was more than just a weapon. It was a catastrophic force, a last resort that was now going to tear apart everything that had been built. At last they reached the surface. Solis pushed open the rusted door, and fresh air rushed in, cool and sharp, as they emerged into the chaos of old New York. The city's skyline was barely visible through the smoke and dust that billowed in the air. Fires raged across the streets, and the sound of distant explosions echoed in every direction. "The Pride," Kessler said, pointing toward a shattered portion of the city in the distance. The warship was still there, battered but intact, just as they had left it. But as Solis turned to lead her team toward it, the ground shook again, more violently this time. "Captain," Vargas shouted, "the weapon, it's destabilizing the entire city. We have to go." Without hesitation, Solis broke into a run, her team close behind. The Pride was their only hope of survival now. But as the streets collapsed beneath them, she couldn't shake the realization that nothing would ever be the same again. The weapon had done its job. It had shattered the Cinder's grip on Earth. But it had also set into motion a chain of events that would change everything forever. And they had no idea what would rise from the ashes. The Pride loomed ahead, its damaged silhouette rising against the smoke-filled sky like a beacon of hope. Solis could see the glow of its engines powering up in the distance. But the ground beneath them was crumbling fast, and every step she took seemed to bring the world closer to collapse. The city itself was dying. Its foundations were being torn apart by the aftermath of the weapon's activation. "Keep moving," Solis shouted to her team, urging them onward as the ground quaked again. The streets were a mess of debris, cracks and fires, the chaos of a city on the brink of extinction. The Cinder had been obliterated, but the price was steep. The Pride was their lifeline, their escape, their salvation. But in the back of Solis's mind, she knew that the weapon's power hadn't just killed the Cinder, it had destabilized everything. The weapon's pulse had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction that threatened to take the entire world down with it. "We're almost there, Captain," Kessler shouted, his voice strained but determined. "We can make it." Solis nodded, her gaze never leaving the warship. But she knew that even if they reached the ship, the battle wasn't over. They were facing the unknown now, an Earth thrown into chaos, without a clear direction or purpose. The weapon had taken out the Cinder, but what had it done to the Earth's infrastructure? The cities, the governments, everything was now in jeopardy. As they neared the warship, a deafening roar filled the air, and Solis's heart skipped a beat. The sound of tearing metal, followed by a series of explosions, sent shockwaves through the city. The Pride was under attack. "No!" Solis screamed, her feet carrying her faster toward the warship. A fleet of Cinder remnants, stragglers who had managed to escape the initial blast, had arrived, their ships circling above the Pride, launching a barrage of missiles and energy blasts in an attempt to finish what had been started. The ship's hull groaned under the assault, sparks flying from its damaged surface. Soldiers in armor rushed from the ship's landing bays, their weapons raised in preparation for a final stand. Solis could see the crew fighting valiantly to protect the last bastion of humanity, but the odds were overwhelming. "Get to the ship, now," Solis ordered, her voice fierce as she turned to her team. There was no time to waste. The team sprinted the last distance, weaving through debris and bodies as the air thickened with the acrid smell of burning metal and smoke. Explosions rippled through the air around them, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Every step felt like a gamble. Just as they reached the ship's landing pad, an explosion sent a blast of heat and force in their direction, knocking Solis off her feet. She hit the ground hard, her ears ringing from the impact. But there was no time to dwell on the pain. She pushed herself up and staggered toward the entrance of the ship, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Captain," Kessler shouted, grabbing her by the arm. "We have to go. Now." Solis nodded, her mind spinning with thoughts of the destruction they had unleashed. She couldn't afford to think about it now. There were bigger things at stake: survival, rebuilding, protecting what remained of humanity. They had to escape before the warship, and the last remnants of Earth's resistance were lost forever. The pride's engines roared to life as they entered the ship, the doors slamming shut behind them. Solace barely had time to take a breath before she was on the bridge, her hands moving instinctively to the control panel. "Status report," she barked. "Shields at 40%, Captain," the comms officer replied, his face tense. "Weapons systems online, but we're taking heavy fire from the Sindar ships above. We can't hold them off for long." "Evasive maneuvers," Solace ordered. "Get us out of here." The ship lurched as the engines powered up, the Pride rising shakily from the debris-riddled landing pad. A deafening series of explosions rang out as the Sindar ships opened fire again, their lasers cutting through the air with deadly precision. The Pride twisted and turned, dodging blasts, but the hull still took heavy damage. Solace gripped the control panel with white knuckles, her heart racing. Suddenly, a harsh voice came through the comms. "Pride, this is Fleet Command. You've activated the Earth Defense Protocol. Earth's atmosphere is destabilizing, Captain. We need you to get clear now." The urgency in the officer's voice made Solace's blood run cold. "Understood," Solace said, her voice steady, though her mind was already racing. The weapon had been more than just a defense. It had triggered a global destabilization event. Earth was falling apart. She had no idea how much time they had left, but if there was any hope for humanity, it would begin with them. "We're going to the backup station," Solace ordered. "All remaining fleet vessels, follow us. We're going to survive this. We will rebuild." The Pride accelerated into the sky, breaking through the atmosphere with a violent jolt. As they tore through the clouds, leaving behind the crumbling ruins of Earth, Solace allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The Sindar had fallen, their empire shattered by the weapon they never saw coming. But Earth was now a broken world, and it was up to them to rebuild from the ashes. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but Solace had always known that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in its technology, its armies, or its weapons. It was in its resilience.